justice. And so that's perfect timing. Anyway, and a year on, well, here we find ourselves. You don't need me to read the newspaper headlines to you, or to, and we have a panel here to sort of digest the detail of it. But I was thinking that, you know, a year ago, I'm sure most Ukrainians didn't think that the head of the railway service would be a star on Twitter, and that a clandestine ghost train from the Polish border would take an American president for 10 to 12 hours to Kyiv for an act of sort of symbolic solidarity from the West. And of course, that what they would have known is that the train journey would have been smoother than this, taking the Acela from Wilmington to Washington, which is what he's more used to. So everything's upside down in some respects, and yet it isn't. And that's what we do here at Fletcher, is try to understand, try to analyze, try to deconstruct, try to make sense of it, and try to suggest ways forward. So the questions that the panel are going to look at: what does this mean for the security and position of small states like Ukraine, but also to take a moment to celebrate the small state leadership of Estonia, talk about calling it right from the very beginning. A woman, of course, an entire, almost the top team in Estonia are all women, and Finland. I mean, who would have thought that Finland would be exercising its diplomatic muscle the way that it is? What does this mean for the norms of large power behavior? Large poor powers, large wealthy powers, large powers fighting proxy wars. What does this mean for neutrality? A fascinating discussion going on in Switzerland at the moment about how to redefine neutrality for this moment in the 21st century. And on and on. This is all the bread and butter of what it means to be at the Fletcher School. And then what does this mean for the broader world system? What does this mean for those of us seeking something better? A global system which has now had to redefine energy security, a global system that just doesn't have the bandwidth or the mind space or the aid dollars to be able to cope with everything else that's going on in the world, as well as trying to defend what is right on the territory of Ukraine. Conflict and its resolutions, and the way in which this conflict is resolved, is existential for Europe and for the European program. A sentence I didn't think I'd read out loud at this point in my life. It's also, one would argue, existential for the rule of international law. Or is that just a very Eurocentric viewpoint? Which is what you would hear if you talk to African diplomats or Asian diplomats the further you go away from the West. So all of that is the bread and butter of this panel. I'm really delighted that they're all here today. I'm delighted that Professor Toft will moderate. And while I hope that peace will come soon to Ukraine, it's our job at Fletcher to roll our sleeves up and try to understand and try to pick a way forward. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dean Kite. We have 4 fantastic panelists. But before I get to them, I just want to give you some numbers. Dean Kite outlined sort of the broad questions and parameters of our discussion today. And as I said, it was a year ago, just over a year ago, or just under a year ago, that we met here in this room and talked about the war. And a lot of pundits and commentary, scholars and policymakers thought that Ukraine was going to fold. But Ukraine did not fold. And here we are, and Ukraine's putting up a formidable fight against a pretty formidable adversary. So just to give you, I have some data points for you. And these are rough because we don't actually have an exact number or science for discerning precision here, in part because governments don't want to reveal the losses on either side or all around. But an estimated 100,000 Russian troops are now casualties of this war, and 13,000 Ukrainian service personnel have been killed. Total casualties on the Russian side is anywhere from 175,000 to 200,000. Think about that. Those men and women are gone, or they've suffered grievous harm. And on the Ukrainian side, it's 40 to 60,000. It's just horrendous. The private Wagner group, who we've heard a lot about, is suffering an attrition rate of 50%. And so when analysts are looking at this, this is truly a meat grinder. When we think of wars of attrition, which Professor Greenhill on my left here speaks about in her own work and her security studies, wars of attrition are pretty bad and pretty horrific. And an average, it's estimated in February, this past month, we have a couple more days left, the Russian military is suffering 824 Russian soldiers dead today. For comparison, the USSR lost 15,000 troops over 10 years in Afghanistan. The US lost over 58,000 in Vietnam, but that was over 16 years, not one. And in Afghanistan, after 20 years, the US lost 2,400. And in Iraq, in 15 years, 4,500. So the gravity of loss here is just unbelievable. And we've also witnessed 7,000 Ukrainian civilians dead, including at least 400 children, and another 11,000 injured. And those are only ones we can catalog, right? There are a lot of people who are suffering mental anguish and loss as well. Russia is firing on average 20,000 artillery rounds a day. Think about that. When I walk to work every day, I think about if artillery were coming my way. Ukraine is firing 4,000 to 7,000 rounds a day. Russia has controlled as much as 27% of Ukraine's territory, up from 7% at the start of the war before February 24th. And today it controls 18%. So Ukraine's regained 9% more of its territory, which is why we're still here, because it's doing a pretty good job of not letting Russia just take its territory. And according to European Union's Justice Commissioner, upwards of 65,000 suspected war crimes have been committed, largely against civilians, but we also know against power facilities, nuclear facilities, and the like. There have been 15 million border crossings, mostly to Poland and Romania, with 8 million Ukrainians having left the country and not returned. The population of Ukraine before the war was at 42 million. And then there's another 5.3 million who are internally displaced, mostly from the east. Russia's population has decreased 555,000 from a population of 146.98 million, with most people fleeing in the fall when Russian President Vladimir Putin decided that he needed to call up an additional 300,000. And when you think about that loss, that's a brain drain in Russia. That's the tech sector and the people who have capital and the capacity to leave. According to the Russian Economist Ministry, Russia's economy shrank 4.2%, but the Ukrainian economy has shrunk a staggering 32%. The war is projected to have increased inflation rates. I think Professor Drezner is going to talk about this globally, and it's estimated to have cost the global economy nearly $3 trillion due to spikes in energy prices, disruptions in supply chain. Shipping costs are up 60%. And food shortages, with Ukraine's exported grains down 46% at one point. It's recovered. It's now currently only down 2% because of the agreements that were struck. And there's been a serious decline in remittances in neighboring countries, which is not a good thing because, of course, those countries need those remittances to keep the population happy. And this is the last point I'm going to talk about, is $166 billion in military, financial, and humanitarian aid has been pledged to Ukraine by 42 different countries. So this is truly an international war with serious global security implications. And I think we're perfectly placed with this panel to have a conversation about this. So to my immediate left is my colleague, Professor Dan Drezner. He's a professor of international politics. And I think importantly for us, he's the co-director of Fletcher's Russia and Eurasia Program, which is sponsoring this, along with my Center for Strategic Studies. We also have Dr. Volodymyr Dubovyk, who's at Odessa Menchikov National University since 1992. And he's an associate professor in the Department of International Relations. We have Professor Kelly Greenhill, who I think if there's undergrads here, she is known around campus in the political science department and teaches the international security class here. And she's an expert on foreign and defense policy. And then to my immediate right, we have Dr. Pavel Luzin, who is currently a visiting scholar with the Eurasia program here at the Fletcher School. And he is an expert in defense and space policy and global security issues. So what we're going to do is have a conversation. I'm going to ask each of them just a sort of a leading question. They're going to talk about 5-7 minutes each, or as little as much as they want. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. We have to have a hard stop at 7, I think. Okay, we can go, I think around 7:15 because there's commitments and flights that have to be arranged because of the weather. So I'm gonna start with you, Dan. So we're gonna start at 30,000 feet, basically. with sort of the global economy and what's happening sort of in terms of the global economy. Then we'll turn to Professor Greenhill and sort of talk about the global strategic environment, security issues. And then we'll turn to Pavel and talk about sort of the regional issues and also the strategic issues. And then Volodymyr will talk about Ukraine and also some of the regional issues that's happening in Ukraine. So Dan, you know, we've been in the war a year. We've seen what's happened with inflation. We've seen what's happening sort of with supply chain, energy prices. But then we also see some recovery happening, particularly, I guess, Russia, right? There was an anticipation that Russia, I think the World Bank said it was going to lose like a quarter of its GDP.
10%.
It's 10%, but it's, you know, now it's actually only about 3%. It's not as dire as we, so what's going on here? What does the war mean for the sort of global economy?
So I think, is this working? Okay, good. So a few things. The first thing to realize is that this, because as Professor Toft said, this war has played out differently from how everyone expected it to. You can credit US intelligence for anticipating that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, but the expectation by everyone was that this war was probably going to take a month, maybe two. And so the expectation here is not just from the US side, it's from the Russian perspective, it was the Chinese perspective, it was everyone's perspective. And this matters because I think that even if Russia anticipated some reaction, obviously, to what was going to happen in terms of the invasion, what I don't think they anticipated was that they were going to have to be fighting a grinding war for at least a year and so forth. Similarly, China, in terms of its sort of friendship without limits for Russia, I mean, the Chinese leadership claims they weren't informed about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in which case that's the worst friendship ever to not bring that up. But the point is that I think they thought this was not necessarily going to be an ongoing conflict. And for that matter, same with the United States. And so we're in a weird situation right now where you can argue outside of Russia, Ukraine, and perhaps Turkey, everyone else wishes this war would end as soon as possible. And the economic effects that you're talking about are because no one prepared in advance for a war of this extended magnitude. No one thought that grain supplies from Ukraine were going to be disrupted for longer than 2 months. No one thought that you would have to, provide this much artillery for a year. No one thought that military industrial complexes were going to have to gear up for a war in which you're seeing World War II level expenditures of artillery and ammunition. And so in that respect, the sort of, aggregate effects are unanticipated because no one thought the war was going to last this long. Now, the fact that it has lasted this long is obviously a credit to Ukraine's defense. It's a credit to, Western aid to Ukraine, and it's also a credit to, how would I put this? Russia's illusions about its own military, which a lot of everyone else seemed to buy. The question going forward is, in terms of the economic effects, the most significant, I think, actually, is that Russia has lost its energy weapon in a way that it had been threatening for 10 to 15 years over the European Union. This had been the sort of Damocles that had been hung over the European Union in terms of the fact that the EU needed Russian natural gas and Russian oil in order to be able to have relatively low energy costs. The counter sanctions that Putin imposed have obviously made it what many thought was going to be a hard winter that turned out not to be all that big of a deal. That you actually have, natural gas reserves in Europe, not what they were anticipated. So it is true that Russia has survived the sanctions somewhat better than perhaps people were expecting a year ago, although I think people's expectations a year ago were wildly inflated. In no small part because, Russia is a continent-sized economy, and it's an economy that prided itself on being truly resistant to sanctions. I think that turns out to be partially true in that they've found substitutes for a variety of things. I don't think they've found substitutes for the sort of high-end semiconductors they need to be able to continue going forward. And so that's going to impose some significant costs on them down the road. They're also going to have real difficulty repivoting things like natural gas exports and so forth. And yes, they're exporting oil, but they're doing so at a steep discount in ways that are costly to them. And they're also not consuming all that much. The Russians can brag about having a current account surplus and so on and so forth. And they're correct about that. But that disguises the fact that the reason they're doing that is because their consumption has gone down significantly, which, if you're a Russian citizen, is not a great thing. I think going forward, the real question you have to ask in terms of the sort of macroeconomic effects in the global economy is, how much are we moving from what had been perceived as a pretty globalized economy to one that is dominated by economic blocks? There's no denying that these sanctions are clearly designed to sort of cut Russia off from the West. And there are ways in which that seems to be over time succeeding. But Russia is not that important a player, actually, in the global economy. The bigger question is, does the rest of the global South decide that they want to try, to trade both with the West and trade with Russia, which is how things are going right now? Or at the same time this war in Russia has gone on, you're also seeing the Biden administration cracking down pretty hard on China in terms of export controls and things like that. And I do think the sort of, question I'm curious about going forward is, to what extent does China view all of this and decide either A, we didn't sign up for this, we want to put some constraints on what Russia's doing. And you sort of saw that with that, peace proposal they put forward, although I did chuckle a bit at that. But nonetheless, it was an attempt. Or do they decide the US is moving in a direction such that our equities in the global economy are no longer worth it? We need to create our own bloc. In some ways, a true decoupling. For all the talk about decoupling over the last 5 years, there actually hasn't been that much. Now we're about to see whether there will be an actual decoupling, not because of Russia, but because of China.
Thanks,
I'll
Dan.
close with that.
Yeah, no, thanks. And so I think that's a nice segue to Kelly, because the question is, are we going to see that similarly in the security sphere, right? NATO has stepped up. Russia has done a favor, sorted in NATO by recreating the threat that led to the origins of NATO. And so the global security environment's changed, and you're seeing alliances. We've got 42 countries allied with this sort of Western effort, but it's not purely a Western effort to help defend Ukraine. So Kelly, how do you see this unfolding and sort of the global security environment and what's happening in Ukraine?
So my comments may be unsatisfying because I'm going to be one of those that says it's too early to say what the global security implications of this war are going to be because it's still ongoing. Well, I would say maybe it's sage in that it's in stark contrast to all of the prognostications that have turned out to be radically wrong on so many fronts. So I think a little bit of hubris and a little bit of humility and fewer predictions might be in order. That being said, I can offer a few observations based on what we do know and what we don't know, and what that might portend. By and large, these observations are going to be arguably a bit cranky because they run counter to the prevailing narratives. So apologies. They're also going to be a bit provocative, so I encourage people to push back. So first of all, if the claim that was out in the world that conventional war is dead and is going to be replaced by gray zone activities that don't meet the threshold of war is not dead by now, it should be. This is bunk. Maybe no one could say the obituary for conventional war was premature by a little bit, but Russia's failure to overtake Ukraine and go through Ukraine like butter as anticipated will now put spell the death knell of conventional conflict. I'll say we'll see. Number two, you might be forgiven if one listens to the rhetoric coming out of Washington and the capitals of the 42 allied countries to imagine that the world is against Putin. And much of the world is against Putin, but the United Nations resolutions last year and last week, I think, shed a slightly more complicated, I should say, at least imply there's a slightly more complicated picture, and Dean Kite alluded to this. So a year ago, 141 countries voted to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 5 countries voted against, including Russia, and the remaining was 47 abstained or didn't show up to vote. Well, what happened last week? 141 countries voted to condemn Russia. 7 now voted against, so 2 joined Russia. in voting against condemnation. And the rest, I think it's now 45, abstained, 32 abstained, and the rest didn't show up to vote. So the NATO has gotten a new lease on life, and the alliance is recharged and rejuvenated and strengthened, but the world's not, much of the world's not going along. And it looks like, to go to Dan's point, that they're going to try to be neutral for a bit longer. Russia's attempt to take over Ukraine did not go as anybody anticipated, most certainly the Russians as well as many others, but their economy as well as their military has been a lot more resilient and robust in terms of sticking around longer than was expected. And the counteroffensive last fall did not go as well as some of the optimists had predicted. So I suspect this is going to be a grinding war of attrition for quite a bit longer. And some of those horrifying figures that Professor Toft highlighted early on, we may be in this for a while. And this matters for those who are fighting the war. It also matters on the humanitarian front. So as Professor Toft pointed out, about 31% of Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes, many of them abroad, many, a smaller number, but still many are internally displaced. The longer the war goes on, the longer these people will remain displaced, and the less likely it will be that they want to go home or that they'll be able to go home. It's also worth noting, though, that they don't have asylum, those that have fled. They are covered under temporary protected status in most places, so they're not, the welcome that's been extended to them in many parts of Europe may wear out, because some of this welcome was extended, predicated on the idea that this would be a short war and temporary. If Ukrainians are going to be living for years and years and years in parts of Western Europe, that could complicate what is already a complicated domestic political situation in many of these Western European and Eastern European countries, where populist parties and extremist anti-immigration parties have been gaining a foothold. So this is an inconvenient observation. I'm not happy about it. It offends me as a human being. I don't like it as an American, but as an international relations scholar, it bears noting. To be still a little bit more cranky, I feel the need to raise what I guess I'll or cheekily call the just a little bit more fallacy. So the argument was made in some circles that we just need to provide another weapon system to the Ukrainians. It started with the javelins and upward from there. Are we going to give them HIMARS? I don't know. The just a little bit more fallacy is a fallacy. Whether we like it or not, the Russians view this as an existential conflict. They are not going to roll over and play dead. This is either going to have to end up in a decisive military defeat, which doesn't look likely, or a negotiated settlement that neither side looks likely or looks inclined to push forward in the near future. So this will mean that the humanitarian catastrophe will continue for some time, and the catastrophe on the battlefield will continue for some time. The just a little bit more fallacy doesn't simply pertain to weapon systems, and I could articulate how we've gone up the escalation ladder with regard to weapon systems, but that would be a little bit inside the weeds. It also pertains to the sanctions. The sanctions were anticipated to be wildly successful at the outset, turned out not to be. Here too, as Professor Drezner pointed out, the sanctions have been effective, but not as effective as anticipated. There's a reason why we're seeking to apply still more sanctions. That's because the belief is that what's already been applied is not enough. I fear that the just a little bit more fallacy will continue to pertain. I could go on, but I'll just give one more note of caution or reason for some concern. There's been a lot of discussion, quite rightly in some regards, of the dangers of appeasement. So it's been noted in terms of public discourse and political rhetoric that we know what happens if you appease bullies. That's how we got World War II. Well, that's true, But appeasement is just one form of this model. There is the other model, which it says that if you have a very resolved, committed aggressor who feels that he or she or they are facing an existential threat, that escalation can be met by counter escalation. And long story short, this can lead to a spiral of conflict and wars conducted under the shadow of nuclear umbrella. And it's worth noting that there are more than 10,000 nuclear warheads out there. 99% of them are possessed by the US and Russia. And so there is always the potential danger of escalation, be it inadvertent, accidental, or as we have seen through the just a little more, intentional escalation. I was in the room last week where someone actually said, I don't think Putin knows where his red lines are, if he has them at all. Well, I don't think we want to find out. And if I'm just going to stop there. I think I've thrown enough cold water
All right.
on the event.
All right, well, thank you, Kelly. No, I think you've put realism on the event and where we're at. So Pavel, turning to you, Kelly raised, and I agree, Kelly, about this escalation ladder and where does it end, right? And one of the issues that you deal with is defense and space policy and nuclear. But I'd like you to talk about sort of the broader regional security dynamics and maybe touch upon the nuclear as well, because this is scary. I think in the fall, we were all quite nervous where Putin was using nuclear rhetoric and sort of trying to make the case that perhaps we're on the brink of crossing the red line, and there was a lot of talk. That seems to have de-escalated. But I think you're right, Kelly, if it gets too tough for the Putin regime or for the Russian government or for the Russian people, they feel as if this is, and it does appear that many do believe this is an existential threat to Russia. We know it's an existential threat to Ukraine, but thinking about sort of the regional security environment as well, sort of the neighbors, the Dean talked about Finland. The Baltic states have been out there. If you look at who's giving what and percentage of GDPs, the Baltic states are right there. And you're thinking about those sorts of issues.
So first of all, I presume not to be afraid of nuclear threat, because if nuclear weapon could be used during this war or maybe in next several years, it will be used despite your peaceful intentions or something else. So it is not the essential threat to Russia. It is essential threat to the Russian political elite. And Russia in this way must be defeated on the battlefield. And this defeat will decrease the nuclear threat, definitely. And after that, Russia must be denuclearized. It's my I don't know. It's a matter of my belief that Russia must be denuclearized, and on exchange of survival of the political elite. I mean, some of these people must be eliminated and then will be eliminated by the domestic political turbulence that is inevitable in this stage of the process. But some part of this elite is still going to survive. Their kids, their grandsons, granddaughters, they want to live. And this may be a part of bargain. You will survive, but you must denuclearize Russia. So I'm not a big fan of the idea that we should somehow to consider Putin thinking, Russian political elite thinking, maybe we should consider their interests. No, Russia must be defeated. And today, Russia already lost all the pillars for its great power status. First of all, the permanent seat place in Security Council, United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council is paralyzed, completely paralyzed. And it must be reformed. Also, other international organizations where Russia has formal leverages and informal leverages, they also paralyzed. For instance, International Atomic Energy Agency, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Red Cross. They are completely paralyzed. And that was the first pillar and one of the main three pillars of the Russian great power status after the Cold War. The second pillar is a military power, both conventional and nuclear. Currently, Russia spent and lost so many weapons, so many arms in Ukraine, and so many soldiers and officers in Ukraine, which will take from 5 to 10 years of manufacturing if we talking about arms. Manufacturing in normal conditions, not in current conditions, in condition of Western embargo on technologies, on industrial equipment, and so on and so on. In terms of soldiers and officers, it will take at least 10 years to restore the capacity of the Russian armed forces that was on the eve of the invasion. And the third pillar of the Russian great power status is a cooperation with the West, with the United States and Europe. Because the Russian modernization in the last 30 years relied on the Western technologies, on the Western industrial equipment, on the cooperation with American and European and Japanese and Taiwanese companies, even the International Space Station. So everything is destroyed. There is no future for, I don't know, for US-Russia space cooperation after the International Space Station. And that's why Russia is not a great power anymore. And it is incapable to be a great power anytime soon in a foreseeable future. And even in domestic level, okay, I told about the coming turbulence, but also the 1 year of the war, of the bloody war, eliminated the significant part of beneficiaries of this war. Because on February 24, 2022, there were tens of millions of Russians who supported Putin, who supported Russian army in this aggression. Currently, we don't know how many of people still support this war, but the number decreased. Why? Because people lost much more, even if they are completely pro-Putin, even if they, I don't know, sent their husbands, sons to the war and got some money with the dead bodies of these husbands and sons and brothers and so on. People got money, people got dead bodies, but what to do with this money? This money are in rubles. And these dead bodies, they will never be resurrected. Yeah. So the number of supporters of the war is declining. The number of beneficiaries of this war is declining, because even the military-industrial complex that Professor Drezner told a couple words about this, even the military-industrial complex is incapable to increase significantly the manufacturing of arms. But it was capable during the last year to increase the number of net losses. Currently, many of the Russian state-owned entities must to decrease the number of employees because they don't have money to continue its operation. So my point is, we shouldn't be too peaceful towards the current Russian leadership, and Russia must be defeated, and then it will be peaceful times, maybe yes, maybe no, but we will have chance to have peaceful times. We will have chance to avoid the world war.
Thank you. Volodymyr, what about the situation in Ukraine and thinking through Ukraine's situation? And it's interesting, Pavel, you raised the domestic political situation, and one of the issues in Ukraine is how much hurt can the Ukrainian population put up with? They are fighting for their home,
Yeah.
whereas Russia's fighting for controlling some pieces of land that some Russians believe is their own, but also seeking to occupy a country that's outside traditionally its borders, whereas Ukrainians have nowhere to go. I mean, yes, they can flee as refugees, they can flee their homes west, but they would like to stay, in Ukraine. So
Right.
is there a point at which you think, President Zelensky may not be able to rally enough as this war sort of grinds on?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. Obviously, if that point is ahead of us, it's still ahead of us. It's not been found. Russia hasn't found, not for the lack of trying, the breaking point for Ukrainians. Like, for instance, in the recent several months, they've decided, okay, let's do missile strikes and drone strikes on energy infrastructure and power stations and so on. So Ukrainians would be like suffering in a cold and dark without internet, water supply. And apparently some people in Kremlin thought it's going to push people into the streets demanding a peace treaty with Russia. I mean, that just tells you again how little Russia knows about Ukrainians, how they value actually Ukraine geopolitically for their great power and new imperialistic project, but how little they ever try to understand what's going on with Ukraine and Ukrainians' minds. So there is still a lot of consolidation. I mean, yes, a lot of suffering, but a lot of consolidation. There is a lot of unity. I mean, there are some cracks maybe within that unity. You see it here and there, because after all, Ukraine is not some country where you have monopoly on power by Zelensky. Yes, has high ratings, he's an international rock star, but at the same time, he has a parliament to deal with, opposition and the media, this vibrant civil society and so on. So he's in a difficult situation there. He's in a bind in terms of like what he can do. He's rallying the people around the flag. He's good with this war rhetorics, wartime leader. So he's communicating that we're going to liberate all our lands. But you're right, of course, Monica, like, can there be a moment when he would actually have to sit down and say, okay, we liberated what we could, right now we can't really liberate anymore. So maybe we would have to sign or maybe even some tacit agreement without some formal official signing ceremony and leave some of those lands outside of Ukraine. Hopefully not. A lot of us in Ukraine are still hopeful that with right assistance, Ukrainian military would be able to liberate more land. And I wouldn't call the counteroffensives last year insignificant in numbers and in territory, like Kharkiv and Kherson were meaningful. And before that, of course, the Russians had to withdraw from Kyiv and Chernihiv. That was also significant. So that really emboldened Ukrainians. So on one hand, it's a good thing because you have confidence. Another thing, you have maybe overconfidence. So people actually, you look at sociological polls in Ukraine, people say 90+%. Yeah, we should liberate all our lands. No question about it. But can we do it? At what point, at what time, at what time frame, and so on. But the war has, as Kelly has said, of course, it's hard to talk about the war because it's not over. So we quite don't know how it ends. And also when people talk about defeat or victory of Russia or Ukraine, there are so many sorts of victories and defeats you can talk about. Like if you Ukraine, for instance, that Ukraine is still there, it hasn't disappeared from a political map, hanging and apparently going to be there, as a sovereign state. We don't know in what exact borders, but it will. So that's already a major victory, from such a powerful mortal enemy in such an asymmetric conflict, which remains asymmetric because Russia is just stronger than us. So, but, or are we thinking about the victory when you have Ukrainian troops marching in victory parade in Red Square? Probably not. And we don't need it, frankly, because we don't have this kind of aspirations. We just want to restore our territorial integrity. So in that respect, we're halfway through. Like right now it's 17%, as mentioned, 17 or 18% of our land being taken by Russia. Is it a lot? I think it's a lot. Definitely in the south where I'm from, in Odessa, if you know that a big portion of Kherson, for instance, is under Russian control, so it's not far, and you think that's a lot, and that still means 83% is under control Ukrainian government. So Ukraine is in a paradoxical situation. We're kind of weakened, but we're also strengthened. We're weakened by aggression, of course. We're losing lives. We're losing economy. Economy is in ruins. We are on lifeline, life support because of Western international assistance, and we worry all the time how long that assistance will last. Can we be sure that that what Biden is saying, that we are with you as long as it takes, he really means it? Because also at the same time, tacitly, apparently behind the scenes, the White House is sending signals to Ukraine like, okay, we kind of wish you, but maybe not like forever, not on that scale, not in this kind of numbers, massive numbers, like tens and tens of over $100 billion and so on. And we know the political landscape in US, you know, you look at the sociological polls here, there's still support for which we're grateful, but it's kind of, you know, sliding away a little bit, it's reducing and so on. But the war has been meaningful in many ways in post-Soviet space for sure. You know, when you see the leaders of Central Asian republics talking to Putin in this new tonality, raising voices, you know, and waging their fingers and saying you have respect us, that's something unusual. That's a usual client states for Russia. So Putin was really bedazzled there and shocked and surprised that someone would talk to him from one of those stunts, you know, that he always despised. You know, Kazakhstan is sitting on the fence in many ways, you know, like including this vote that you mentioned at the UN, but there's a lot of support actually coming from Kazakhstan to Ukraine. There are many of those resilient points and yurts, Kazakhstan yurt center, and they're in downtown Kyiv, and people find you know, warmth there if they need it in the middle of the winter. There's Moldova, which is, you know, one might say still there because of Ukraine's resistance, because when Russian troops were early in the war rolling across South Ukraine along the Black Sea coast, people were wondering what's going to happen if they get to Moldova. They would definitely take Transnistria under their control, but they might not stop there, you know. So, and now, of course, Moldovan situation is volatile, you know, and you kind of see it as a not stable, but at the same time, maybe safe enough because of Ukraine's resistance. If you look at Belarus, you know, if Russia prevails over Ukraine, Belarus is done. There's no such country as Belarus anymore. I mean, their sovereignty is already under question right now as we speak. But if Ukraine does not, you know, lose, you know, Russia does not win, you know, then Belarus has a chance of actually getting rid of this horrible regime that they have in place, and one day become a viable, democratic, open country with free and fair elections. So it's going to be big thing for the entire Baltic Black Sea zone there if Belarus switches side and becomes a normal country after many years of Lukashenko regime. If you look in the north, you know, you have Baltics and you have Poland, of course, who are mostly actively supporting of Ukraine for various reasons. A lot of people are just outraged with what they see on TV, but they're often, of course, motivated by their interests. Because, of course, again, if Russia's done with Ukraine, then they're emboldened. You know, we have a saying that your appetite comes while you're eating. So Russia might actually want to try and do something, maybe in a hybrid way against Estonia or Latvia. So unsurprisingly, I went to a rally here at Copley Square yesterday, and you had a lot of this Latvian flags, Lithuanian flags, Estonians. You know, they understand what the stakes are. You know, similar thing in the south. You know, Romanian, Bulgarians, they're dealing with Russian aggression in different ways, maybe, but they're terrified. There is a lot of anxiety in the Black Sea and volatility in the Black Sea region. Turkey is sitting on the fence in many ways, balancing carefully. You know, trying not to be choosing side, but it's also part of a bigger balancing game between West and Turkey, the rest of NATO and Turkey, you know, so, and of course, elections are coming up. And of course, there's been an earthquake, politically damaging, and that's going to be interesting what happened to Turkey. And speaking of Moldova and Turkey, by the way, I'm looking forward, Monica, to that trip, and some others here in the room that the Tofts is doing the study trip to Turkey. And a couple of us actually going to stop a couple of days in Moldova as well. So we'll check the temperature in the room. We'll see we're going to meet with a lot of our Turkish colleagues, what's happening there, what's the mood there. And, you know, it's everywhere you look. China's been mentioned. They're really looking hard at their chances and what their options, rather, what they should do. You know, of course, they decide to actually give more weapons to Russia. That'll be very unfortunate for Ukraine. If they continue with their neutral position, that's fine with us, of course. I mean, even if their rhetorics and ideology and propaganda machine would be aligned with Russian propaganda, well, we can live with that, you know, just not them giving weapons to Russia, obviously. Same thing with India. Also, we can remember last year how they talked to Putin at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, basically reprimanding him publicly on the video on record, and also openly saying that he shouldn't use nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. That's a big deal. So that's another thing. If he actually uses them, he kind of really damages his relations with both Beijing and Delhi and the global south. And the global south is indeed neutral mostly, which is already also fine with us. I mean, unless they actually decide to support Russia more actively. So when we see things like South Africa, for instance, taking part in exercises, military exercises with Russia and China, it's not good. You know, it's not good optics for us. We are not happy. But at the same time, we understand what's driving it. You know, it's the logic of old Cold War, inertia of those times, anti-imperialism, anti-Americanism, what have you. So we cannot change anything right now with the global South. It's going to be a lesson for all of us, Ukraine, US, you know, not surprisingly, Secretary Blinken is there often, you know, that the global South came up like they did, you know, with this position on this war. But for right now, it's okay if they're neutral. We can understand this argument, like it's not our war, it's 1,000 miles away from us. You know, it's similar to the non-alignment movement of the Cold War time, so in many ways. But the war is changing. NATO has been revamped, it's already been mentioned. You know, the eastern flank has really been pumped up with assistance, and they're better ready for whatever might happen. Obviously, maybe not quite 100%, but they're getting there. The European Union, by the way, came strong, you know, with the whole crisis. You know, no one really expected this, because European Union is usually seen as a timid, indecisive, very bureaucratic kind of red tape kind of actor. But right now, if you look at how they're supporting Ukraine, including giving money to buy weapons. Think about it. The European Union is giving Ukraine money to buy weapons. That's about $4 billion, by the way, euros. So, and hosting refugees, and of course, cutting drastically within months on the supply of Russian gas and oil. And the rhetorics, you just look at what Ursula von der Leyen is doing there. It's amazing, actually. It's a big moment for the European Union, I think, in terms of finally them becoming a viable, sound security actor. So I think the results are all around us. I mean, we can go on. We can go on with a listing of the effects and implications and impacts that we already seen from this war. But then, of course, as Kelly said, much will depend on when it will end and how it will exactly end. Right now, Ukraine is weakened, but at the same time, it's a leader in the region. You know, a lot of people look to it as for guidance. We might say if Ukraine prevails in this war, after the war, it might be a leader of the greater, wider Black Sea region, for instance. There might be new formats there. People already talk in the Baltics, for instance, the UK, Baltics, Poland plus Ukraine kind of format. It could be something emerging in the Black Sea. So there could be some very serious seismic, noticeable changes in security environment, but some of them we are already observing, but they're not irreversible, and we'll have to wait and see until the war is over. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Volodymyr. Now you can hang on to it for a second. So Pavel, I'm just going to come back to you for a second, because we asked about the tipping point, sort of this hurting stalemate side from the Ukrainian. For Russia, I think you're right. I think this is about regime survival, but Putin's done a pretty good job about talking about how this is a threat to Russia itself. It's an existential threat, by putting the four constituent republics, now it's appended in the constitution, that he now can claim that they're fighting for Russian homeland territory, right? Luhansk, Donetsk, and as a student of Russian history, Russian literature, Russians can put up with a lot of pain. They can. Historically, they've shown the capacity to do that. So, and you are starting to see, particularly in the minority regions, the bodies are coming home and people are upset and they're like, why is my son dying in a faraway land? But it takes a lot for Russia to overthrow its government. So what can persuade Putin and company, and perhaps the Russian population, that this candle's not worth it?
Putin tries to act like a Russian Tsar, but he lives in different reality, because you may mobilize soldiers, send them to the war, they will die. You may mobilize another portion of soldiers, send them to the war, and at the end you will capture some territories, like Russian Empire acted since 15th century. But currently, the Russian society is a highly urbanized society. 75% of Russians live in cities, in towns. The Russian society is not agricultural. There is no demographic resource for such type of imperialistic behavior like the Kremlin tries to realize. Let's back to the armed forces. 10 years ago, there were 10.5 million young Russian men, age from 18 years old to 26 years old. 10.5 million. Currently, there are only 7.1 million. And by 2030, there will be less than 7 million. So it's impossible to act like the old-fashioned SARS. Also, during the whole year of the war, the Russian authorities tried to create an ideological narrative that would, to approve the aggression against Ukraine. Denazification of Ukrainian government. What else? Demilitarization of Ukraine. In October 2022, there was also desatanization of Ukraine. Some religious thinking, but it wasn't popular. Also, there is a narrative that Russia faces the third patriotic war. The first patriotic war was against Napoleon. The second and the great patriotic war was against Hitler. Currently, there is a third patriotic war. That is a continuation of 1945, because the West became Nazist, and the West supports Ukrainians who are the biggest Nazists in this world, and so on and so on. But there is no, resonance within the Russian society towards this narrative. Currently, a couple of days ago, Putin said, guys, if Russia will be defeated, Russia will be disintegrated. We will see not Russians, but Moscovites, Ural people, Siberians, and so on and so on. But the most popular reaction to this statement in the Russian social media was, so what? We live in Ural, we live in Siberia. Yes, we are Siberians, we are Ural people. And if we live in Moscow, yes, we are Moscovites. So what? What is the threat? People in Perm or in Yekaterinburg, they are not going to die for Crimea, for Donetsk, Luhansk, definitely. They even are not going to die for Rostov-on-Don or for Voronezh or for Moscow, because people in rural areas usually hates Moscow more than they hate Ukraine. So I presume the Kremlin is in a tricky situation right now. It is still struggling for survival. It is prolonging the agony on the battlefield, but it is still incapable to create a narrative, ideological narrative for society.
Yeah, but I look at the public opinion polls, and it's just astonishing to me that Putin, assuming that we can accept them, right? He's still very highly rated. I mean, he's up in the 70s.
Only 14% of people, 14% of people are ready to answer to pollsters. 86% of people are not going to say something to any pollster, whether or not it is a governmental pollster or independent pollster or something like that. Yes, we still have a huge part of the Russian population that is scared about the future, that is, who are dependent on the Russian government. I mean, in terms of income. And the Kremlin is going to pay for the loyalty. But these people are going to get this money. They are going not to protest against the Kremlin, but they are not going to do something in favor of Kremlin. I mean, they're not going to donate for the Russian armed forces. They're not going to donate for suffering population of Donbass. they're not going to die on the battlefield. And the main problem with mobilization in Russia was that not too many people were going to be mobilized. And that is also the problem. People declare their support, but they do nothing. And support cannot be just word. Support must be act.
Mhm.
There is no acts. There is no actions.
Yeah, we tend to call them fence sitters, which leads me to you, Dan, and actually, Kelly, I'll follow on with you about your conventional war is dead sort of thing. So China, right? China seems to now sort of be a linchpin. We're very nervous. It's a formidable economy. It's got weapons. The United States, we're running out of 155 millimeter rounds, even for our own. Yeah, we can't even produce them. We're actually worried that if, God forbid, we have to face a war with China at some point, that we don't have the ammunition ourselves now to defend ourselves. But in any event, China seems to be a very critical linchpin. We've heard about Iran also supplying drones. North Korea now, of course, God forbid he be left out, you know, the president of Korea, North Korea. But China, I mean, where are you seeing the China piece in this, Dan? Because they have been a country that sort of lets other countries do what they want. It believes in hands-off international affairs. States are sovereign entities. It has been the ultimate fence sitter, did try to offer a peace plan, no matter how you thought about it. But, you know, where do you see it turning in this? And then Kelly, has this sort of Russian defeat, because you're right, Volodymyr, Ukraine's still there, right? If Putin had his way, Kiev would have been rolled over in a day and that was it. Is there any sort of demonstration effect here about just how costly this is really sort of a modern war, conventional, lots of armor, lots of artillery, infantry? Do you think anybody's learning any lessons maybe? So I'll come to you, but Dan, what about China and what do we do with China here?
I don't have a great answer for this because the problem is that from China's perspective, this war has been a strategic disaster. It's hard to underscore that because, you know, if you go back 13 months, you know, Xi Jinping thought, okay, I've cemented my partnership with Russia. Russia is probably going to absorb Ukraine relatively quickly. You know, I can then focus on my issues, Taiwan, and then, you know, we can, you know, continue to divide and conquer with respect to the transatlantic, the sort of OECD countries. And none of that has played out the way that China expected. So the interesting thing, what? Yeah. But the interesting thing is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine didn't just change European perspectives on Russia. I would also argue they've started to change European perceptions on China. And that's the thing that in some ways is probably most disconcerting for China. And indeed, you know, from all the press reports, part of the reason they put out this peace plan, and I really should put those in air quotes, but the fact they put out the peace plan in the first place was not because they thought it was going to be enacted on. It was to try to make a gesture to the Europeans to demonstrate, see, we're not really the bad guys here. And I don't think it's worked, frankly. In terms of what they're going to do, I mean, you know, it's worth pointing out that I tend to agree with Volodymyr that if you look at what China's actually done, they've rhetorically supported Russia, but it is clear they have provided minimal material support. They've bought a lot of Russian oil, but they've bought it on the cheap. And by the way, this is what China does. Whenever there's any sanctions regime out there, it's not that China violates the sanctions. China just sees a bargain to be struck. And so they will be perfectly happy to buy whatever they can at prices that are incredibly painful to the seller. So yeah, Russia's been able to sell oil, but they haven't been able to necessarily make all that much money. My concern on this, honestly, much more so than Russia, is where does China see its position in the global order going forward? And this gets back to what the US and the West think. In other words, and this is where I actually think the Biden administration has been less clear, actually, which is what is China's place in the international order? And, you know, Exhibit A on this was the reactions to the balloon, which, you know, clearly threw a massive monkey wrench into, you know, bilateral relations. And this isn't to absolve China. China clearly screwed up there, but this was also clearly a screw up at middle management level that, you know, didn't go up to the higher ups. And yet the response by the US military apparently has been to shoot down everything, you know, including student weather balloon projects, because suddenly we're freaking out about this. My concern about this is that this is sending a signal to China that there might be no accommodation going forward between the two countries. That yes, you know, the difference, and whenever I've gone to Russia, whenever, you know, I've been asked about the bilateral relationship between Russia and China, or between Russia and the United States as opposed to China and the United States, the thing I always say is that the advantage that the Sino-American relationship always had was the ballast of economic interdependence. That no matter what the political leaderships on both sides wanted, there were strong, you know, investments in persisting in the status quo in a way that never existed between the United States and Russia, because there wasn't ever much in the way of trade. What I am beginning to worry about is that both sides are now viewing the other as, in fact, this is no longer a sustainable status quo. And if China starts looking at the future and thinking, there's no point in investing in this global order, it's time to create a new one, then you're really going to see an interesting sort of set of institutions being created. You're seeing China try to wean itself from the dollar. You're seeing China trying to, you know, create these parallel institutions. Now, to be honest, I don't think any of these things are terribly viable. You know, they're more like hedging. But the interesting question to ask is, when do they stop becoming hedging, and when do they become the primary means through which China tries to pursue a global order?
Mhm.
And I'll close on this minorly scary thought, and it's a bad historical analogy, but it's one that's appropriate. The way to think of China now is in some ways to think of Germany right before World War I, which is they're the most powerful actor in Eurasia, and yet they also perceive themselves as surrounded. And they also have only one great power ally in Russia, and Russia is like the Habsburgs
Mhm.
in that they are slowly decomposing.
Mhm.
I'll close on that.
Thanks, Dan. That's really a nice segue to Kelly
Yes.
about whether China, and that's who we're thinking about. Is China learning any lessons here about war? Because of course everybody's concerned about Taiwan and ramping up in South Asia and, you know, the South China Sea. So what do you think?
Well, I'm not a China expert,
I know, yeah.
but the China experts I heard from recently would say China thinks time is on its side.
Which is
Well,
a good thing.
yes,
That's
yes, it's a
really
good thing and
Yes.
potentially peace inducing.
Yeah.
In terms of your question about, well, first I want to go back to and respond to Volodymyr. If I gave the impression of saying that I didn't think the counteroffensive was impressive, let me correct that point. Very impressive, but my but was we overstate so much. So it's not that it wasn't impressive and significant. It's simply that it's, yes, and that was my point. So lest that be lost. In terms of lessons to take away about conventional war, and I wouldn't want to put words in Xi or anyone else in China's mouth, but one might say what we observed about Russia is limited to Russia, because well, on a whole host of reasons, but among other things, a lot of the money that went theoretically to modernization and the vaunted Russian military clearly did not go to modernization and to building the not so vaunted Russian military. I do not believe, based on my limited knowledge, that the Chinese view themselves in the same position. I wouldn't even say, based on the observables, again, because I'm only looking at the observables, that evidence suggests that it is the same vis-a-vis the Chinese. And if they also think time is on their side, then I don't think that we should necessarily be imagining that there's going to be an invasion of Taiwan imminently. But I also don't imagine that, based on the Russian experience, that we should imagine that now conventional war is dead. I think at the same time, what happened or what has happened so far in the Russian-Ukraine war should give a lot of people pause in thinking about war, because it is costly, the outcome is uncertain, and quite often these things go on longer than we anticipate that they're going to. Even those that are the good wars, almost always they go on longer than we anticipate that they're going to. I'll stop there for the moment because I want to make sure we have time
Yeah.
to hear from the
No,
audience,
and I think the US learned that with Afghanistan.
among
Despite-
other places.
Yeah, despite they should have learned it in Vietnam. Maybe they should have learned it in Korea.
In Korea,
but-
yes.
But well,
yes.
anyway, but there's a long history. I have a whole thing that I'll go off about the first Persian Gulf War, which was a tragic victory. But maybe
Well,
we'll
and
get
even
to it.
there, we we overestimated how successful we were there. Half the Republican Guard tanks were left standing when we swore at the time that they weren't. So, fog of war is a real thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, so we have about a half an hour for questions. There's 2 mics in the audience. So are we going to pass them, or we're going to have students get up and, so please introduce yourself. Yeah, and if you could address, if anybody has a question for Volodymyr, he has to leave to catch a flight before the storms come through.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That this was really insightful and really timely. I remember last year, this actually room was packed. So it's been a while. So my question is to Professor Drezner, actually, about China. So one point that I slightly disagree is that I personally believe China has an interest in prolonging this war because they keep buying like gas and oil relatively cheaper compared to like Europe, and like they have Russia weaker on their northern border. Basically, I mean, I don't think they're like inherently allies, China and Russia, so they actually have more flexibility in focusing on Taiwan and more immediate foreign policy agendas, and I think it's an evidence that like lately that there are these intel reports that China might be considering selling some lethal weapons to Russia and some drones is a sign that China might have decided to go more supportive of Russia's war effort, stopping like short of a nuclear escalation. That is apparently a red line. So what does that leave American sort of response, like in terms of China and like in terms of America's support for Ukraine? Thank you very much.
And what's your name and where are you?
I'm Mustafa Gül, by the way. Also, I'm excited, Professor Dubovyk, to go to Turkey with you. Like I'm the research assistant that is organizing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Just quickly, just because China doesn't wish the war continue doesn't mean China isn't going to find ways to profit off the current status quo. So yeah, it's obviously getting relatively cheaper oil. It can't get that much in the way of cheap natural gas. Natural gas can't be rerouted that quickly. And in some ways, that's one of the problems that Russia's facing. I should acknowledge my fellow co-director of the Russia and Eurasia Program, Chris Miller, couldn't be here, but Chris wrote a fantastic book about Russia's periodic turns to the East whenever it finds itself spurned by the West, and how every time it does this, it winds up being tragically disappointed, which does suggest what might be happening going forward. In terms of what the United States can do in terms of the reports, it's worth noting those reports are coming from the United States. The reason we're seeing these reports is that US officials are saying we have intel saying this is happening. And this is actually something we didn't talk about, but this is an interesting innovation, I do think, on the part of US diplomacy has been both in the run up to the invasion of Russia or invasion of Ukraine, but also now US officials are being much more willing to declassify information and or announce we have intel saying this is happening publicly as a way of trying to either convince allies, convincing global public opinion, and so on and so forth. If nothing else,
Prevent false flags.
prevent false flags. If nothing else, from a perspective of the United States, what this has done is, if not erase, let's say right over the stain of what happened in 2003, when you had, Colin Powell going to the UN declaring that we had solid US intelligence about Iraqi WMD. So in other words, we have now the case where you actually have the US saying, look, this is going to happen, and then it actually happened. And what's interesting to me is that China has tried to vigorously deny this and has said, no, this isn't going to happen. Bear in mind that not everything in the Chinese political system, despite the perception that she runs everything, not everything actually works like that. And so I do tend to wonder if one of the reasons why this was made public was in some ways as a sort of warning to China's political leadership that even if they don't want to do this, there might be elements within the Chinese state that do. That would be my read of it.
Gentleman here.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much for everyone coming. I'm undergraduate student Artem, Ukrainian Vietnamese. So I have a question. The Russian presidential elections are coming in 2024. And I wonder, like, what might change until then and what is stopping Putin from ending the war? Because to my understanding, and someone who has relatives in Russia, etc., right? The propaganda in Russia is effective in a way that he can make up random stuff and he can end the war and absurdly say that we've successfully denazified, desatanized, demilitarized Ukraine. And in the worst case, they can keep the Donbass for themselves and Ukraine might not even ask for Donbass anymore, as long as Russia retreats from the 18% that they claim. So what is stopping him? It seems like he's still over-optimistic with the current situation that he doesn't end the war and he still keeps pushing for it. So that's, I'm curious about it.
So Pavel and Volodymyr, too.
I prefer not to care about elections of 2024 because election is a wrong word here. But towards the calculations of the Kremlin, it looks at least like it was declared in December 2022 in Collegium of the Ministry of Defense, during the Collegium, that they realized that they don't have sources to continue fighting beyond 2023. Currently, they see the limits of their capabilities. Whether or not they will achieve these limits or whether or not they will be able to extend these limits, we don't know. They don't know this to date also. So we'll see, but don't care about elections of 2024.
Yeah, well, I don't know about elections 24, but we have our elections too, by the way, in 2024. Zelensky apparently is going to be running, but we'll see about that. He is currently very popular, but things might change, as I alluded in my first initial remarks, because right now he's very popular, he's wartime leader, but if he has to preside over some kind of compromise, painful compromise with Russia, that might change. Actually, in a position at that point of time would jump on him really hard. In terms of Russia, well, clearly Putin was shocked with his initial failures, but then he decided to double down. He saw an opening. He decided, okay, well, let's do, mobilization and things, and our economy is still working. They can fund the war indefinitely, so that's a problem. The sanctions been mentioned, they're not working properly. I mean, there are still huge loopholes here and there, and there is not much of enforcement. And you need to go after the violators more robust and more actively and aggressively if you're EU and US. So, and then he says, okay, I'm going to mobilize these people. And a lot of people were dismissive about mobilization. I wasn't. Because okay, I mean, it's 200,000 or 300,000 people, even if it's not well trained, not well equipped, not well motivated, still a lot of manpower, and you just add it on the battleground, where Ukrainian troops are already, kind of stretched thin. So that's a lot of pressure, and you see it in the Vuhledar and Bakhmut and other places. If he does another round, maybe of the same amount of people, then it's going to be even more difficult. If someone gives him weapons, well, yeah, it's hard. It's hard. So. At the same time, I don't know if I buy entirely Pavel's dismissal also of how his narrative is not working in Russia, because you know better, obviously, than I do. But I think a lot of enough Russians believe this narrative that, okay, they're out there to destroy us. So it's basically now a just war for us, a patriotic defensive. They want to do away with Russia. So we have to, whether we like this regime or not, whether we like Putin or not, it's entire, war out against us. We need to survive somehow, and that means we need to fight. And also, finally, by the way, this message that Russia will be disintegrating is also a message to the West, which is intent to scare everyone in the West, because historically, the fear of Russian disintegration has been one of the worst nightmares in the West for a long time. It's not just 1990, 1991. It's actually going back to 1919, maybe 1905 even. When in the middle of Russia-Japanese war, President Roosevelt suddenly changed his position, in terms of who needs to be supported, because he was terrified of the revolution ongoing in Russia at that point of time. So yeah, disintegration of Russia is really a concern. destabilization of this huge space to everyone in the West. And that's why they're using all these messages, they're trying to push this message into the West, like to terrify the West. Oh, okay, wow, of course we don't want them using nuclear weapons, but we don't also want them to disintegrate and create this huge wave of instability for the entire Eurasia. So therefore, we probably just should stop now and apply some pressure on Ukraine and stop giving these weapons and actually talk sense into, Kiev, to give up some of their land.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Dan, do you want to come in on this?
I just want to say something quickly. It's from something Pavel said, which is, it does strike me. We all talked about how in the last year, everyone's expectations were completely upended, that everyone expected a quick war, and it obviously didn't happen. Our expectations now are that it's going to be a long slog stalemate. And I do want to throw out the possibility that maybe that's not what happens either. Because one of the interesting things that we've seen is that I expected Russia to move down the learning curve when it came to how to prosecute a war. And if there's any indication so far, it's that Putin has done the exact opposite. By replacing Surovikin with Gerasimov, what we're now seeing is essentially Russia essentially doing a replay of what they tried last May and June, which led to temporary victories, but in the end laid the groundwork for Ukraine to have that successful counteroffensive in August and September. And it would not stun me if 2 months from now, 3 months from now, we see a similar attempt. In other words, we might see this replay again, in which case it doesn't mean Ukraine wins, but suddenly instead of talking about 18%, you're talking about more like, 10%. And then that becomes something that I don't even think Putin can hide.
But back to the student's question, I think it's a correct one, given that Putin at this point has sought control of the media space, right? It is a mystery as to why, perhaps they fathom the idea of declare victory, just control that 27% that it has right now. And actually, I think they're at 18%, and declare that victory. And it's because I think they're ready for the spring offensive. The ground is frozen. He's probably going to give it one more shot, and we may see an end in summer. We may not. But we'll see. Yeah, Volodymyr.
They may want to declare it the victory, but Ukrainians will continue to fight. That's a problem. That's a problem with them,
Yeah. No, that's true too, unless you could strike the deal with the Ukrainians to say, and that's the problem, Zelensky right now cannot. He cannot cede territory because Ukraine sees, Dan says, that it sees a path to victory, right? If it can cut off Crimea, which is what it's trying to do desperately right now, and it's going to try to do that through that spring offensive, Ukraine's in for the long haul.
You're right. I mean, the Ukrainian military is stretched thin, but as Dan has said, actually thousands of military being trained right now with new weapons everywhere in the West. If you just add them, that's another major push on for Ukrainian side. But also, even if Russia uses technical nuclear weapons on the battleground against Ukrainian troops, they still don't win the war. So that's one of the reasons they probably wouldn't do it, because they're also not stupid. They understand that's not going to give them victory right away. So, but that would actually damage their relations with Beijing and Delhi and the global South, and that we really make them in the global pariah. So they're kind of mindful of that. Not to mention there might be a strike by NATO countries against Russian troops in Ukraine.
But it's also worth keeping in mind, we keep crossing our own or backtracking from our own red lines. Like, we're not going to give this to Ukraine. We're not going to give this to Ukraine. We're not going to give this to Ukraine. And we keep giving. So we're sending the signal that we are with you. Now, how long that will last, we'll see. But he could declare victory if the Ukrainians keep fighting and we keep telling them there isn't a reason that you need to negotiate. Of course, they're going to keep fighting. So
several days ago, some Russian small medias, but pro-governmental, they started to push the idea that we don't need all these Ukrainian territories at all. We destroyed a big portion of the NATO weapons. These weapons currently cannot be used against us, against Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so on. So it's okay. We may withdraw our weapons from Ukraine.
It'll be interesting, the rhetoric. All right. So Kelly, did you want to say? All right. This gentleman, and then Anshu.
Thank you very much. My name is Christopher Warrior. I'm an LLM student here at Fletcher. I would like to ask a question about the trajectory for Ukraine's EU membership. They've been granted candidate status as of last year. They've adopted important legislation. They've held people accountable in different levels just recently. So at what point do you think that Kiev will start to push Brussels harder for membership, and how will Washington help them to push?
Well, I think we're overestimating just the role of Washington and everything. But yeah, here, of course, the candidate status is a big thing. It's kind of symbolic. I mean, it doesn't mean that we have the doors open to EU right now. I think it's going to be still a lengthy process, so it's kind of a price that Ukraine got because of being so resilient and heroic by European Union. They were looking for like, okay, what can we do? And even then there were a bunch of countries within European Union who were actually very supportive of Ukraine on the battleground, give weapons and so on. But they are very formalistic about the membership. And they said, okay, we have a procedure, we have rules, we shouldn't break them, even in the case of Ukraine. Countries like Netherlands and Denmark, some others. So I guess it's going to stay as a situation there, because a lot of countries would say, no. I mean, heroic nation, we should support them, but doesn't necessarily mean that we should open doors for the European Union to Ukraine. Not to mention that it's a huge responsibility, of course. It's a big country in the war right now, destroyed, really in ruin. So I'm personally not expecting, anytime soon, Ukraine getting closer to the membership, but I'll be happy to be proved wrong. Yeah.
Thank you. Anshu?
Hi, I'm Anshu. I'm a second-year MOL student here. My question is to Professor Drezner. Professor, you mentioned the possibility of moving from a globalized economy to economic blocks. And then you also mentioned that China's situation right now looks like Germany pre-Cold War I, which I agree. But what I am thinking is, will the move towards economic blocks, formation of economic blocks, also spill over in the security environment? Like, will there be, can this lead to a fight for alliances as we see NATO getting more stronger, more coordinated in response to Russia's aggression? Do you see China and the West fighting for allies as well if the situation continues? And what will it mean for the security environment?
I mean, to some extent, it's already happening. I mean, first of all, bear in mind that it depends on what you mean by alliance. It's not, don't use the word alliance, because China's only formal ally is North Korea, and that's worked out real well for them. But, think about it more in terms of partnerships. And you're already seeing that to some extent in terms of, let's say, competition for rare earths in Africa, or attempts to diversify global supply chains in the Pacific Rim. Now, I want to stress that most of the global South wants nothing to do with making this choice.
Mm-hmm.
They would rather, they don't want to have to be put into one economic bloc or the other. And so in some ways, that's the one break on, or that's one of the breaks on all of this, that even if the United States might want this to happen, and even if China might decide, okay, now we want this to happen, most of the rest of the world wants to be able to, deal with China in terms of production, or, export to China and also export to the United States. So, my hunch is that there's a lot more talk right now about decoupling than there is actual decoupling. My concern is that that's true now. I'm not sure that's going to be true 5 years from now. That all of the sort of, distribution of power, distribution of interest, and distribution of ideas is all starting to skew things more toward the belief that globalization is not beneficial to us, whether you were in Washington or Beijing or anywhere else, except the global South. And so one of the interesting questions, and I don't think we have an answer to this, is what does the global political economy look like in a world in which most of the great powers have decided, no, we want to have economic blocks, but most of the world's population decides, no, we don't want that at all. It's a legitimate question. It's an interesting question. That's a good book topic, actually. Okay, never mind. But I mean, I don't have an answer is the point. I wish I did.
Thanks, Anshu.
Hi, Jeremy Coffey, GBA. My question's for Volodymyr. You've referenced a couple times the Ukrainian opposition to Zelensky, so the political opposition in the country. What's the makeup of that opposition? I imagine there are plutocrats that are funding politicians that want to kind of keep their power from previous regime, but who else is in that kind of coalition, if you will,
Right.
that's holding Zelensky to account?
Well, those are the veterans and mainstays of Ukrainian politics, primarily Poroshenko and Tymoshenko. They've been around, they have really political intuition and good guts. And right now, of course, they've decided, okay, it's a war on our hands. Zelensky is a wartime leader. We shouldn't really upset the unity and coherence of the country and consolidation. So we're gonna just keep numb and just be silent and everything. Like, for instance, recently, a couple of days ago, Zelensky had a press conference and he had some critical questions from a journalist from Fifth Channel, which is kind of close to Poroshenko. And he got unhinged a little bit and, got into the journalist. But it was an interesting reaction by Poroshenko. He was basically said, okay, well, I don't have a comment, so he didn't want to use this situation to upset Zelensky, undermine Zelensky. So, but when the moment comes, they'll be there, and people remember that Zelensky wasn't very popular before the war. Of course, a few days before February 24th, ratings in the upper 20s, that he probably made some mistakes before the war, like for months, not heeding or actually angrily dismissing American warnings about the incoming imminent invasion, and what happened in some places of Ukraine, like in Kherson, why Kherson was taken and, so quickly, why there was no defense in the south, so there'll be questions and many Ukrainians are mindful of those questions. So the opposition going to use it when the time comes, just not yet, but that's what I mean. So, but anyway, it's not a vacuum, not a vacuum of for Zelensky. He lives in a very meaningful, active, vibrant political space, unlike Putin, who's sitting there on the cloud, and not in that sense that we all hope, but yeah. But and no, there's no competition. There's nothing. Everyone is terrified. Everyone knows that he's probably making a mistake with this big war. But what can we do? The big guy decided. The grandpa decided to do it. So that's it. But with Ukraine, it's different. Again, Zelensky has a lot of power and leverage right now because of like martial law and everything. But still, he has no monopoly on power even now.
Thank you, Volodymyr.
My name is Vitaly Kozyrev. I'm professor at Endicott College, just North Shore. I have quite a few students. I'm teaching European and American foreign policy this year, and some of my students asked actually me to deliver this question to Volodymyr. The question is, I have a hard time to explain why actually did Ukraine not decide to reintegrate Donbass back based on the Minsk agreements? Because, and we all know Berlusconi actually recently said that, okay, if they have stopped shelling Donbass, probably nothing could have happened, right? So, and then the further developments could be, okay, reintegrate, and then probably in 15 years, Ukraine would be a modernized country with the help of Marshall Plan from the European Union, part of the European Union, and becoming a showcase for the rest of the Soviet republics, and including Russians, who would be, a lot of Russians I know in Russia are willing to join Ukraine, not like Ukraine being part of Russia, but Russia will be part of Ukraine. So why did this happen in terms of like implementation of the Minsk agreements?
Yeah, well, first of all, Minsk agreements were flawed from day one. They were really signed what was a gun against the head of Ukrainian leadership at that point of time, both of them, after Ilovaisk and then Debaltseve. Second of all, they were not really implementable in the real way, and a lot of people struggled with that. You remember Steinmeier formula, but it wasn't implementable. Now people actually ask Steinmeier himself, and he says, I don't think it would have worked if the people would try to walk that way. That people said what Steinmeier formula was declaring. The other side wasn't doing anything, in terms of getting to the implementation of the fulfilling of their agreement. I mean, they part of the bargain. Russia was basically saying it's not even our issue. We're not part of the conflict. Like, what about that? I mean, of course, the country part of the conflict. Without Russia, there wouldn't be a single shot fired in Ukraine ever since 2014. So Zelensky, when, as you remember, he came president of Ukraine in 2019, basically promising negotiation and quick stop to the war, that he would sit down with Putin and find some kind of solution and compromise. But we quickly discovered, I mean, there's no appetite in Moscow to do that whatsoever. He tried to do something about Minsk agreements, but he couldn't. So, I mean, it was just way to nowhere, and that was just a leverage for Russia to try and destabilize Ukraine, and maybe ideally return Donbass under their conditions, and it would become like a Trojan horse, really a veto power within Ukraine, undermining the coherence of the Ukrainian state. Didn't work. So then Putin decided, okay, no more hybrid games. I'm going in the hard power 100%.
Thanks, Volodymyr. And I know you need to go. So join me in thanking him for joining us. Mike?
Hey, good evening. My name is Mike Sparks. I'm a PhD student here at the Fletcher School. Thank you for being here. My questions for Professors Drezner and Greenhill. I want to go back to China. I was curious as to your thoughts on the narrative that the Chinese position has actually benefited from the prolonged war due to the depletion of American strategic stockpiles, particularly these anti-platform weapon systems that will be necessary to repel any type of Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And that kind of goes into this just a little bit more fallacy you spoke of earlier. How much pressure do you see the Biden administration receiving and equipping them with, say, the F-16 that President Biden commented on this weekend, simply because they don't have anything else to give? And these are platforms that would allow the Ukrainians to then penetrate into Russian territory and kind of extend the limits of the geography that we've seen thus far.
So what's the question? Do I believe that the Chinese are benefiting from
I guess
this?
that was more directed towards Professor Drezner.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
fallacy piece was at the end.
Yeah.
We're running out of these anti-platform
Yes.
systems, the
Mhm.
rockets, the missiles.
So,
How
so
much
do I think
pressure-
we're going to go the next step up the escalation ladder?
Yes.
Huh. You answer first.
For what you're saying to be true, Mike, it would have to be true that China's going to make a move at Taiwan in the next year or two. And based on what Kelly and others have said, I don't think that's what they are intending to do. So I guess the answer is still no. I'm not convinced that this is a strategic benefit for China. Although I'm getting enough questions about this so that maybe that's a minority opinion, but to me, this seems obvious that this isn't working out in the way in which they had intended.
Yeah, China just wants to maintain the status quo, right?
And this is disruptive to the global economy, which is not great for China. To the extent that it keeps us distracted from focusing on China, yeah, I would say that's a benefit to China. But I don't think I would change my answer from before. Do we go the next step up the escalation ladder? This would, if in terms of the systems. If past performance is any prediction, then the answer would be yes, but maybe Dan will be right and things are about to change. Let me try to be slightly more serious about this. My guess is we try to wait it out till we see what happens with this likely spring offensive, and then we reevaluate. So I think we haven't decided, and I'm not going to predict, not because I don't want to be well, number one, I don't like to predict because I think people are wrong, but I think we don't know, and much will depend on what happens between now and if the spring offensive is conducted in where we are after it happens, assuming it happens. And I mean that on all sides. So that's not going to be a very satisfying answer to your question, but I would say feel free to email me later in the spring. I'm happy to continue the conversation down the line.
And one thing I'd raise, Mike, is, and what we want to keep in mind that comes up time and again in this war, is that this is a multi-level game happening, right? So Biden has a domestic audience. It has allies. You read back to the debate about the M1 Abrams tank. It wasn't trying to get the Germans to give their tanks, which are actually better suited for this fight for a whole variety of reasons. And then the Brits saying, well, we're giving ours. So there's alliance politics happening here. There's international politics, regional politics. And so it's a very complicated stew. The United States wants to show that it's a good ally. And then, of course, the allies want to show that they're good allies. And then the Chinese are telegraphing both domestically, but they're also telegraphing to Russia, right? Because Russia has been a good partner. I agree with you, they're not an ally, they're a partner. China will abandon them when it doesn't serve their interests anymore. And then, of course, the United States, which the United States, we still have a lot of leverage over China because of our interdependence on the economy. But that means, of course, China has leverage on us too. So that's why I think, Kelly, you were the one that said, we don't know yet. It's so complicated, right? But you want to keep in mind that the multi-level games and the signaling that has to go across on all of these different decisions that are being made. And so,
and it's dynamic. So it's
and it's
multi-level and it's dynamic. And so there's a lot of moving pieces. And so that's, to be fair to a lot of the folks who have gotten it wrong, there are good reasons why they've gotten it wrong. And we're going to continue to get some of it wrong going forward. So
Which
we'll see.
we just, I guess, be asking better questions, right? So this gentleman here.
Thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. So my name is Yucheng Ge, a undergraduate from China, majoring in international relations and economics. And I actually want to share something from the perspective of the Chinese people, not from the Chinese state. Either is the communist China in Beijing or the nationalist China in Taipei, from the Chinese people, not the Chinese state. So actually, as a Chinese part of the Chinese people, I have some reservations on Professor Drezner's argument that China is more like the pre-World War I Germany, the German Empire, while Russia is like the Habsburg, the declining empire. The reason that I have this reservation is that like Russia, since the beginning of the modern age, is among one of the two empires, the foreign empires that inflicted the greatest harm, the greatest injury on the Chinese interest, especially since the beginning of the century of humiliation in the early, in the late 1940s. I still remember when China was facing the Second Opium War from both Britain and France. It was Russia who usurped the land that is equivalent to the total of Germany and France. It was about 1 million square kilometers large in Outer Manchuria, which is in north of the Amur River and also east of the Usuri River. It was Outer Manchuria in the 1860s, and also in the later decades, Russia usurped the land in the outer northwest of China, which is in outside of the Tian Shan Mountain, in the outwestern border of China. And then in the early 20th century, Russia used all sorts of strategies to take Outer Mongolia out of China, and was caused the so-called independence of Outer Mongolia. And in 1940, in the late 1940s, when Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government won the war against Japan, it was the Soviet Union who organized a so-called referendum in Outer Mongolia and used the so-called the people's will of Outer Mongolia. That was equivalent to the so-called the 99.9% of the votes in Outer Mongolia to have this the de jure independence of Outer Mongolia from the Republic of China. So from the perspective of the Chinese people, Russia has always been one of the largest invader that harmed the Chinese interest since the beginning of China's modernization. It's even before that. Like
So
Japan
what is,
was an
so what is your question?
yes. So my question is that would this kind of like historical memory about the China-Russia conflicts or confrontation cause the Chinese state, I mean the Chinese state in Beijing, to change its neutral policy or its attempt to become neutral in this geographical conflict and become, more assertive in its measure toward Russia?
Dan?
No. I'm sorry, that was a glib answer. Let me put it this way. The one way in which this war might come to a more decisive end is if China did decide to weigh in a more aggressive way to say, we will not tolerate this anymore. We don't just, propose a ceasefire. We will threaten, Moscow unless they actually stop fighting in Ukraine, because that would be the sort of last pillar that really would seriously cripple the Russian economy. I don't think they're going to do that, though. While I understand all of the sort of historical grievances that you're discussing, and that makes me slightly nervous about the future of Sino-Russian relations, the truth is that China can't afford to, China does not want to, I think, pick at that scab right now. And furthermore, this is a situation where, in some ways, China probably gets the best of both worlds if it continues the status quo, which is, even if it does, it obviously cares about Taiwan. I don't know if China cares about territorially reclaiming, parts of the West or parts of the North, especially when they can engage in economic expansion in those areas anyway, and they don't need to worry about the borders. Taiwan is one thing. I don't think they're going to try to push for absorption of Outer Mongolia or to try to expand back to the Tian Shan Mountains, because their economic weight is such that they actually have significant influence in those areas anyway.
And it would be very costly.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll take the last two questions. So
Yes, just
again,
following
and
up.
then here.
Yeah, thank you. Just actually a question about Dan's concerns about China's probably like kind of hopeless in terms of reconciliation with the United States, given the United States pressure on China. And there is a deliberation in China to what extent actually China is ready to further help Russia with a probably lethal weapon, given the fact that there is probably no hope to restore relations with the United States. So my question to Dan is actually, are there any kind of risk assessment of potential sanctions or secondary sanctions by the United States, of the West against China, in terms of, given the fact that we all seen the limitations of sanctions against Russia in terms of potential damage for the global economy and the Western economy. So probably China, could you assume that China has calculated already that it will be too costly for the West to impose sanctions on China, further sanctions on China, even more maybe damaging the West rather than China?
Thank you. And then this gentleman here, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Dan from the GBA program. For those of you wondering about the arms that we're sending, some of those are relatively old. Better question is, why were they effective? I won't tell you what I do for a living. I would only say that check out a book called The Kill Chain, because there's something to be said for Russia right now has an incredible influence machine, but they're fighting against intelligence. And if you've known anything about what's going on with Russian intelligence officers right now, it's probably not a good time to be near a window if you're one. So on that point, to talk about the human capital of it, every single time that one of those high-ranking officials ends up out a window, or every single time one of those officers gets shot out and who's a commander, the lead time to just enact the command and control aspect of it is years, 10, 15, however many. So the question that I have is, do we continue, like, is the reason why that our policymakers are not allowing Ukraine to fire into Russian territories, is that in order to try to keep them from having too much pressure applied too quickly, so that way you don't have the collapse into the individual tiny little countries all over the place? Is that so that way you can preserve Russia but still defeat it on the battlefield?
Well, I think I could, yeah, in that case, so thanks for the question, Dan. Yeah, defenestration, right? The human capital losses in this war are tremendous. And Russia's going to feel them, because the people who are leaving for the Stans, Armenia, Azerbaijan, it's the best and the brightest, and they have capital and they have know-how, they know how to leave. So Russia's losing a lot of human capital. And you're right. Every time, this is what Stalin did before World War II. This is not old history in Russia. You take out the people who are the threat, and then they're going to have to rebuild. And Stalin had a mental breakdown when the Germans came, and maybe Putin will, who knows. But in any event, yes, the human capital losses are grave. And then,
Despite all of that,
yeah,
Russia survived the war.
it survived the war, but survived it under
Again, I'm not
horrendous
carrying a brief for.
Yeah,
I'm just saying.
sure.
if we're gonna
I don't,
carry it-
yeah, but I don't think Russia's going anywhere. That's the thing. I don't understand why the Biden administration, Scholz, the German Chancellor Scholz, why they don't say every day, we don't want Russia to go anywhere. We just want you to leave Ukraine. That's it. Leave Ukraine, leave Ukraine, leave Ukraine, leave Ukraine, right? Every day I would get up in the morning, say on CNN, leave Ukraine. That's all we're asking for. So it answers your second question, Dan, which is that it is a war of defense for Ukraine. It is not an offensive war. And the minute Ukraine has weapon systems, armaments, or whatever, go over that border, it loses its legitimacy. Right now, it's in a fight for its life. It's in a fight for its home. Look, somebody comes in my home, I'm going to shoot the shit out of them, right? But I cannot run out on the street and do that, right? So that's the difference. They will lose their legitimacy. Yeah, Massachusetts, you're allowed to, right? You're allowed to defend your home. You're allowed to defend, your home. Well, anyway, but that's what's happening. And so if Ukraine does it, that's why that missile that landed in Poland, there was lots and lots of investigation of that and try to establish where that came from. And so Ukraine can't do that. So write your Congress people, write President Biden, just say, leave Ukraine, Russia, stay intact. Putin, you can stay in power. Yeah, you're a schmuck. right? You can stay in power, but just leave Ukraine. And then we're going to have the big problem is, what is Ukraine? What pieces of territory? And for the Ukrainians now, it's before the war, it wasn't Crimea, it was Donetsk, Luhansk. Now it's all of it. And the question is that will be the sticky issue, is what is Ukraine? And we're going to have to figure that out after the spring offensive, and Kelly Greenhill will tell us what it is.
I think we should just close on that.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not kidding. That was the best way to close. I mean, that's the big
Okay.
question. So,
All right.
yeah.
All right. Maybe we'll reconvene in the spring after the offensive. All right. Thank you. Yeah, we should do this again in the spring.